Good morning, good morning, good morning. How are you doing? It's an honor again for me to be able to speak with you, with our amazing church. Today I want to talk about a very familiar verse to some, but not where the place where most of us think of when we hear this specific saying. Man should not live by bread alone. Most of us, at least for myself, when I think of that term, I think of my mind immediately goes to when Jesus was being tempted by Satan in the wilderness right after his baptism, and he was going through 40 days worth of fasting, and Satan was tempting him to turn these stones into bread. And Jesus' response was, man shall not live by bread alone, but every word that comes, from the Lord. And Jesus was actually quoting scripture when he said that to Satan. In fact, he was quoting Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Now, I want to quickly read this Deuteronomy chapter 8 in the first several verses. And it says this: the whole commandment that I commanded you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go and possess the land that the Lord swore to give your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. So you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and by fearing him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing out in the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. I want to just talk real quick and about my experience. When I was several months ago, we were looking to see if we were supposed to move or not. And my wife and I, we took a trip down to North Carolina. And it was an amazing trip seeing my cousins, my cousin Dominic and his wife, which his wife is pregnant. They're due any time in the next week or two. And yay, pray for them, Dominic and Emily Bianchi. But the highlight of the trip for me personally wasn't going out and checking out the land or seeing what all the opportunities that were there. It was actually eating my cousin's food. And my cousin was an amazing cooker. The whole time we had amazing food. And he actually made his own bread very similar to this. I've been so inspired by him that I started making my own bread. This is a loaf of sourdough bread. And I've been thoroughly enjoying it ever since. But sourdough bread starts off, the main type is, the main base of it is stuff called a starter. It's called a starter. Now, for thousands of years, in fact, up until 1868, when two Jewish Hungarian immigrants first commercialized or made the first commercially produced yeast, that's how people made risen bread. They had to use what's called a starter base to make their bread rise. And this was something that would have been very important to the people, because Starters took a while to cultivate, and they also would have been passed down from generation to generation. It was a unique thing to a family or a unique thing to a certain people group. And for having to take care of a starter, it's something you have to feed twice a day. You have to water it and feed it and keep it perfect and all this other stuff. And you can actually get very attached to your starter. When God was calling the people out of Egypt, they weren't allowed to take their yeast. They weren't allowed to take their starter. It was something that they would have had and held on, that would have been a part of their everyday life. They had to leave that part of their everyday life behind, something that they depended on literally for their daily bread. They had to give up. That's why then when they left, they had to eat unleavened bread, this flat bread, because they didn't have an opportunity to take the 6 hours it takes to cause your bread to rise. I want to just point out several things here. Just in verse 3, where it says, "And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna." This concept of being humble means it's to be brought down. It's almost like bread without yeast. It's low, it's brought down, it's flat. It's to be humbled, is to be brought down to the base of what's really there. And throughout this whole process, I know that it's a humbling process for us as individuals, but hopefully it's a humbling process for us as a nation, in which we're all of our pride that we have, we boast ourselves on all of the pride and exhibiting, and may this process bring us humble, bring us down to our knees, and bring us low, in which we can experience that we actually do have a hunger, and our hunger can't be met with things, with items, with activities, with entertainment. But God did create us, and we have a missing part, and that's Him. And the only way that we can have our true hunger met is if we feed on this divine things that God is providing. For the Jewish people in the wilderness, it was manna. For us now, Jesus is He's the true bread. He's the true source of all of the things that we need. I love this one section in verse 4 when it says how the way God provides, their clothing didn't wear out, their feet, they didn't swell after all of the traveling. And I pray that God will divinely meet the needs of His people at this time, that the things that you have, they'll supernaturally be watched over and not broken down and not worn out. May God meet the needs of His people. And continuing, going down into verse 6 through the end of 10, and it describes all the things that was supposed to be in the land, whether that is fountains, waters, springs, fig trees, pomegranates. There'll be no scarcity, stones with iron, and all these items that would be able to meet the needs of the people. They would have these additional things, but they weren't meant to be a distraction from who supplied them. They weren't meant to be a distraction because they had experienced having fully relied on God and realizing that the God is the originator and the source of all of these great things. And I pray that for our country, and I pray that for all of our believers around the world, that we'd be able to, once we get back to maybe some normalcy, or once we get out of this or come out of the woods, and once this epidemic is over, that when we do have those frivolous and nice things to use again, that we won't take them for granted, that we would be thankful and grateful, and that we'd realize that God is the source of all of these things. I do want to, just as a church, if we could pray for those people who are being really affected by this. My wife has some friends who are nurses, and it's let's lift up our doctors, let's lift up our nurses, and let's use this as an opportunity to humble ourselves, to realize that everything we have is because of God's allowance, that we won't live by bread alone, that as we're being humbled, as we're getting brought low, as we, like the Jewish people, had to leave behind things that they would have relied on for their daily bread. Let's realize that God is our true source. And that's it. That's all I have. I hope you guys are blessed. Enjoy. Bye-bye.